This is a video record of our New England Fall Colors cruise from October 14th to October 23rd, 2010. On that cruise, we sailed out of New York and visited Portland, Maine, Harbor, Maine, St. John, New Brunswick, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Boston, Massachusetts before returning to New York. A cruise to see the changing of the colors in New England had been on our bucket list for many years. But since such a trip was only possible in the fall, and since my job precluded me from vacationing in the fall, we had never been able to even consider such a trip. Since I had just retired in June of 2010, we now had the freedom to take such a cruise and went ahead and booked it. As it turns out, we would be celebrating our 35th wedding anniversary in the fall of 2010, so the timing of the cruise couldn't have been better. Our ship was the Royal Caribbean Explorer of the Seas. The Explorer was built in the year 2000 and has a capacity of over 3,000 passengers. The Explorer is smaller than the Freedom of the Seas, on which we had sailed the year before. The Explorer was built in Finland and is just over 1,000 feet long, 160 feet wide, and weighs 138,000 tons. When I started making plans to make this compilation video, I had a digital set of Robin's 3,400 still pictures that she had shot on the trip and a brief printed summary of the trip. Access to the video clips I had shot, however, were another story. The video camera I had on the trip recorded on a small video cassette. I remembered transferring the video from the cassette onto my computer just after the trip, but I could not find a copy of that video now. After a week of unsuccessful efforts to transfer the video from the original video cassette, I finally found a digitized copy of the video. And now here is my completed video of our 2010 trip. We left home on October 11th and flew nonstop to New York City, the start and end point of our cruise. Leaving on the 11th gave us a couple of days of sightseeing around New York City before the cruise. After getting our luggage, we caught a shuttle from the airport to our hotel, the Hampton Inn, Manhattan, Times Square North, just a few blocks from the middle of Times Square. This is our room in the Hampton. Notice the red suitcases that we ended up using for over 10 years. On October 12th, our first day in New York, we woke up, had a leisurely breakfast, and made our way to the nearest subway station. Our first stop on that day was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, aka the Met. This has to be in the top 5 museums in the world. While the Met has a huge collection of art, like this famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, calling it an art museum does it a disservice because there is so much more in the Met than just art. For example, they have whole sections on Egyptian artifacts, medieval armor, and entire rooms lifted from mansions and castles around the world. There are also sections of ancient Greek and Roman buildings, and ancient frescoes, and even very early examples of formal attire. Later that day, we visited the zoo in Central Park, where, among other animals, we saw polar bears, penguins, and seals. On our second morning, October 13th, we walked to the ABC studio in Times Square to watch them film an episode of Good Morning America, GMA. Robin had made this sign recalling the time on an earlier trip that we had met Robin Roberts, one of the hosts of GMA. We also got to see Sam Champion, the GMA weatherman at that time, and Juju Chang, another GMA host. At around lunchtime, we walked to the old Ed Sullivan Theater where they filmed The Late Show with David Letterman. We wanted to get tickets for that night's performance, but first we, like everyone else, were asked a few questions about the show by a staff member. If you knew the answers, you got the tickets. If not, no tickets. Letterman obviously only wanted true fans of his in the audience. Since we were not huge fans of Letterman, we flunked the test and did not get the tickets. After that, we went to the Rockefeller Center. Later, we went to the World Trade Center Visitor Center, where we took a tour of the area led by this lady who was an eyewitness to the tragedy. That night, we went to Times Square, where we spent the evening. The next morning, October 14th, we boarded a shuttle bus that took us to the Cape Liberty cruise port in beautiful downtown Bayonne, New Jersey, across the bay from New York City. We had booked a junior suite on deck 9. Did we like the suite? Well, here are my and Robin's reaction to it.
And this is our suite, and it is that. Biggest room we've ever been on a ship.
Absolutely the biggest. It's so fabulous. It's so wide and it's so deep. Like you said, it's like square.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so large and roomy. It's fabulous.
So is the balcony huge too. Oh yeah, we also have a walk-in closet. I never thought I'd have a walk-in closet on a ship. And then here is the bathroom. Anyway, this is a full shower and tub.
Next to the junior suite we had on the Oasis of the Seas, this was the biggest cabin we ever had on any cruise ship. After we had a chance to freshen up, we took a tour of the ship, starting with the library. From the library, you can look down to the Royal Promenade. The Promenade is a collection of shops, restaurants, and bars, a feature found on many of the bigger Royal Caribbean ships. Also, like many Royal Caribbean ships, the Explorer had a Johnny Rockets hamburger restaurant and an ice skating rink, used mostly for ice-capade type shows. This is the Explorer's buffet restaurant called the Windjammer. Since neither Robin nor I like to eat in the formal dining room for breakfast or dinner, we always had those meals in the Windjammer. This is the ship's main theater venue, called the Palace. On the top deck are two of the ship's pools and a few of the hot tubs. On the deck below that is the exercise room, which shares its space with this indoor hot tub. Outside, but still covered, is another hot tub. This is another of the pools, but this one is totally inside. And finally, there was this little room towards the front of the ship where the ship is steered. After we toured the inside of the ship, we walked outside to get a view of the Statue of Liberty with the Manhattan skyline behind it. The Explorer set sail at 5 o'clock that afternoon. When we reached the end of the pier, we noticed this sculpture. It is called the Teardrop Memorial, a 10-story sculpture that was given to the United States as an official gift from the Russian government as a memorial to the victims of 9/11. After we cleared the dock, the ship slowly made its way out of New York Harbor, and soon we were well out to sea. As he would every night of the cruise, our cabin steward came in while we were at dinner and left us the daily activities pamphlet for the following day. The entire next day, October 15th, was an at-sea day. The weather was cold and overcast, and the ocean was a little rough. We hoped that it would not become the standard for the rest of the trip. The sun came out later, and we spent the day relaxing and doing some reading. That night, we ate at the ship's Italian restaurant called Portofino. This was one of the upscale restaurants on the ship. It was always fun to have dinner in a nicer restaurant than the buffet Windjammer. Portofino cost a little extra, but the portions were huge. After dinner, we went to see the first of the ice skating shows. Because of the time of the year, they made Halloween the theme of this show. The next day, October 16th, we arrived at our first port of call, Portland, Maine. We had sailed a distance of about 400 miles. The morning started out bright and sunny, but it would soon turn cold and overcast and stayed that way for the rest of the day. We were a little disappointed that in Portland, at least, there were almost no signs of the change of the colors. There was very little to do in Portland, so we just started out by walking around the town. It was interesting to see that many of the streets were paved with bricks, which indicated that Portland was a very old town. This was one of the few trees we saw in Portland that had changed color. We hoped that as the cruise continued, we would see more widespread effects of these color changes. The only excursion that looked halfway interesting was taking a ride on this amphibian truck/boat called a duck, a vehicle that was left over from World War II. We booked the excursion and boarded the duck. We drove around to the opposite side of Portland Bay where there was this boat launching driveway. Without slowing down or stopping, the driver took us into the bay. The water in the bay was choppy, which made us both a little bit nervous. We cruised around the harbor a bit, then started back towards the Explorer. We passed close by the Explorer and then around the dock next to it. Interesting sign, huh? After we got back, we saw this statue of the movie director John Ford. We learned that Ford had been born and raised in Portland, and that the city had commissioned the statue to honor him. We did a little bit more shopping, and then we returned to the ship where we had lunch and spent the rest of the day. The ship left Portland at about 5 o'clock, which was just about sunset. These are some of the shots Robin got of the sunset. As was often the case, ships like the Explorer had to use the services of a harbor pilot who guided the ships out to sea. This was the pilot boat that night which took the pilot back to Portland. At the end of the evening, we returned to our cabin and were greeted by the next day's activities pamphlet. We hoped that we would have a better day at our next port than we had in Portland. The next day, October 17th, we arrived at our next port of call, Bar Harbor, Maine. On this leg, we had sailed a distance of about 110 miles. Bar Harbor does not have a pier at which cruise ships can dock, so any cruise ship stopping there has to anchor offshore. To transfer passengers to and from shore, cruise ships have to tender, that is, use 2 or 3 of their lifeboats for this purpose. After breakfast, we took one of the ship's tenders to Bar Harbor, where we boarded a bus for an excursion we had purchased. The excursion took us to scenic areas near Bar Harbor. The first such area was called Acadia, which is in the hills above Bar Harbor, where we could see the Explorer and the town of Bar Harbor. The view from up there was magnificent. Later, we were driven down to the ocean and were surprised to see the rocky makeup of the shoreline. I looked like I was enjoying this excursion. I was. A while later, we reboarded the bus and drove to this Maine Lobster Museum, a must-see for any traveler. Wink, wink. We even had an actual lobster fisherman tell us everything we ever wanted to know about lobsters. At the end of the dissertation, he showed us this very rare blue lobster. How rare is it? Well, the chances of coming across one of these in nature is close to 1 in 2 million. We next visited the College of the Atlantic, a small school with about 365 students offering degrees solely in the field of human ecology. When we got off the bus, we were immediately struck by the sight of trees changing colors. Finally! Now Robin was a real happy camper. The thing we were there to see was this house that was donated to the college for free. The house was built in 1895 as a summer cottage for the wife of a millionaire from Cincinnati. The house is called Turrets. From the grounds of the college, we could see the Explorer. After seeing the turrets, they took us to the town of Bar Harbor. This town fit my image of what a typical Maine town would look like. Small, with friendly people, and things that had disappeared from almost all American towns, like a village green, and this drugstore soda fountain. We had lunch at this lobster restaurant. Robin, of course, had lobster. I, of course, had a veggie burger. We ended up the day outside the Bar Harbor Inn. Walking around the grounds, I was able to understand more about the attraction these kinds of small towns have for big city dwellers like me. At the appointed time, we caught the tender back to the Explorer. We went to bed that night excited about seeing our next port of call, St. John, New Brunswick. We arrived at St. John on the next day, October 18th. We had sailed a distance of about 130 miles. St. John was one of the places in Canada to which American colonists who were loyal to England fled after our Revolutionary War. The Loyalists who came here actually founded St. John. This painting shows Loyalists drawing lots for their lands there. The weather that day was sunny but very cold and windy. We had booked a bus tour of the city for that day using one of the pink double-deck buses in this picture. After breakfast, we went ashore and waited in line for the bus. The first place we visited was a small park called King's Square. As we walked in, we saw this monument. As we got closer, we could see that it was a memorial to Canadian military deaths. In the middle of the park is another monument. This one is called the Loyalist Cross, which honors those Loyalists I mentioned earlier. Right next to King's Square is the Imperial Theater, which, in its heyday, was one of the vaudeville stops in the vaudeville circuit. On the other side of King's Square is the Loyalists' burial grounds. Only the original Loyalists can be buried there. We next visited the St. John City Market, where the locals come to buy their food. Just outside the city market is this city bus stop. At that bus stop, the city has placed several comical statues. Robin and I took turns posing with the statues, trying to see who could make the funniest pose. After we finished the tour, we returned to the ship. As the ship was preparing to leave, I remembered something that I had heard on the bus rides around St. John. This building, called the Steamer's Lobster Company, dates from the early 1800s. At that time, it was the home of a shipping business. Supposedly, Benedict Arnold worked there until he returned to live in England. I'm sure that's the reason there's a picture of Arnold on the front of the building. I got this video as the ship was pushing off from the dock. After a few minutes, Robin took this picture of me. Then we traded places, and I took this picture of her. Robin was all dressed up because we had made a reservation for that evening to eat at one of the fancy ship's restaurants, and she got ready first. Very pretty, babe. As I said at the beginning of this video, we were celebrating our 35th wedding anniversary on this trip. That night, the ship sent us this complimentary bottle of wine and glasses to help us celebrate. On October 19th, the day after we left St. John, we tied up at Halifax, Nova Scotia. This time we had sailed a distance of about 330 miles. By the way, in case you don't know it, Nova Scotia means New Scotland. That morning, the weather was good for sightseeing. After breakfast, we left the ship and walked to a double-decker bus to start the excursion we had booked. Before we boarded the bus, we posed with an actual Canadian guard who was overjoyed for this opportunity. Our first destination is called the Citadel, an old military fort that was built in the mid-1800s. With the help of this aerial view of the Citadel, you can see the star-shaped fort is built on a hill. In the background you can see the wharf area, and this is where the Explorer was docked. The Citadel has a changing of the guard ceremony and the firing of a cannon every day exactly at noon ceremony. Other than those two things, there wasn't much to see at the Citadel. We next went to a park called the Public Gardens. The centerpiece of the gardens was this gazebo. The grounds were quite beautiful, and we got to see more of the changing colors of the trees. There was also a small lake that had a very interesting feature. It was a scale model of the Titanic guarded by a family of ducks. Next, we switched from the double-deck bus to this more traditional bus. This time we had a guide who would describe the connection between Halifax and the Titanic. It only took a few minutes to drive from the Citadel to our next destination, the Fairview Lawn Cemetery. The guide told us that the morning after the Titanic sank, Titanic's owner, the White Star Line, chartered 3 ships from Halifax and 1 from St. John to search for the dead. This was one of those ships. Most of the recovered bodies were buried at sea, but the remaining bodies were returned to Halifax and interred at the Fairview Lawn Cemetery. Our guide took us directly to the Titanic burial site.
We're going to start down at this end, and I'll go in and we'll get everybody in close, because there's quite a large group, and I want them to be able to hear as well.
Whether by a plan or by coincidence, the grave markers are arranged in a shape that looks remarkably like a ship. Many of the markers have no name associated with the person buried there, so our guide concentrated on the markers that have some special significance. One of those markers is for an unidentified child known for decades as the unknown child. The child had been buried with funds provided by the sailors of the ship that recovered his body. In 2012, DNA testing identified the child as 19-month-old Sydney Leslie Goodwin, an English baby who perished with his entire family. Since 2012, the cemetery has added a marker inscribed with the baby's name. This grave, marked J. Dawson, gained fame following the release of the 1997 film Titanic because the lead character in the film is named Jack Dawson. Since then, people have been leaving flowers at the headstone on the mistaken assumption that this is the character's grave. Recent DNA research, however, has revealed that the grave actually belongs to Joseph Dawson, one of the Titanic's crewmen. This is a colorized photograph of Dawson. After spending about an hour at the cemetery, we reboarded the bus and drove to our next destination, Peggy's Cove, about 25 miles southwest of Halifax. Peggy's Cove is a small and very picturesque fishing village. Fishing is such an important part of Peggy's Cove that the town even commissioned this stone frieze called the Fisherman's Monument. Peggy's Cove is one of the most visited places in Nova Scotia, but it still maintains a rustic, undeveloped appearance. I think if you look up the definition of quaint in the dictionary, you'll see a picture of Peggy's Cove. Since World War II, tourism has flourished to the point that it forced the civic leaders of Peggy's Cove to place restrictions on who can live in the community to prevent inflation of property values for year-round residents. This is Peggy's Cove Lighthouse, also known as Peggy's Point Lighthouse. It is Nova Scotia's most well-known and most photographed lighthouse. Like Maine, much of Nova Scotia's shoreline is very rocky. This is one of the hotels in Peggy's Cove. After Peggy's Cove, we drove back to the ship. That evening, Robin got a fantastic shot of Halifax as we sailed away from it. That night, we went to see another production show in the Palace Theatre. The next day, October 20th, was another at-sea day. It was a sunny day, but also cold and windy, so nobody spent much time outside. We did, however, take advantage of the indoor swimming pool. At lunch, we had a hamburger and fries at the Johnny Rockets. We even treated ourselves to a couple of malts. We didn't do much that day. We mostly hung around our cabin and rested. It was good to have time off after 3 days of sightseeing. The main show that night was again less than stellar. We really slept well that night. After a day and a half and 425 miles at sea, we arrived at our last port of call, Boston, Massachusetts. We docked at the Cruise Port Boston. We had booked a guided bus excursion that would turn out to be the best of all the ones we had taken during the cruise. We would be seeing Boston, Lexington, Concord, and Harvard University. This was our guide. He knew everything about everything. We boarded our bus and started towards downtown Boston from the Explorer. On the way, we started feeling a little disappointed. We had hoped that the fall colors would have been already in full bloom by now, but alas, they were not. Not yet, anyway. As we drove into Boston, we caught a glimpse of the USS Constitution, the United States' first warship launched in 1797. We next drove by this bar that was the inspiration for the bar in the TV series Cheers. After that, we passed by the Parker House Hotel, home of the Parker House Rolls. Our first stop was at Copp's Hill Burying Ground, founded on February 20th, 1659. It is the second oldest cemetery in Boston. I think this is the oldest grave in the cemetery. 1693. Right across the street from Copp's Hill is the smallest house in Boston. It measures 10 feet wide at its widest point and has 4 floors. It is called the Skinny House and was built shortly after the Civil War. It is also a spite house. Here is an interior picture of the first floor. 2 blocks from Copp's Hill is the Old North Church, aka Christ Church. This was the church from whose steeple Robert Newton placed the aforementioned signal light. This is the inside of the church. After leaving the church, we walked down a pathway called the Paul Revere Mall. At the other end of the mall is the famous statue of Paul Revere. Just past the Paul Revere statue is the St. Stephen's Church, whose bell was made by Patrick Henry. By now it was noon, so we went to have lunch. A couple of blocks from the Old North Church, we passed by the Bell in Hand, which is the oldest continuously operating tavern in America. Right next door is the oldest continually operating restaurant in America, called the Union Oyster House, where we had lunch. The interior was a feast for the eyes. The Oyster House has hosted many famous personalities, including John Kennedy, who had a favorite booth, and Barack Obama, who loves oysters. After lunch, we walked around the corner to the indoor Quincy Market, which is a collection of many different kinds of shops and eateries. After touring the market, we reboarded our bus and left Boston for our next destination, Lexington. After a relatively short bus ride, we arrived in Lexington. It stopped at the triangular-shaped Lexington Common, an old term meaning small park. At one corner of the common is this statue of a Minuteman, the name that the individual militia chose to call themselves. Near the middle of the common is this monument erected at the site of the first encounter of the Revolutionary War between the Minutemen and British troops. At this point, our guide started to explain the series of historical events that happened in the spring of 1775. He told us that King George of England had heard reports of possible rebellion in the American colonies. Most of the leaders of this rebellion were residents of Boston, so he sent British troops to Boston with orders to capture those leaders and squelch the rebellion. A short time after the troops arrived, word got around that the troops were going to march west to Lexington and Concord. On the evening of April 18th, the night before the troops left for Lexington, Paul Revere, along with his counterpart William Dawes, made their famous rides to warn Lexington and Concord of the impending danger. The next morning, April 19th, the British troops marched about 15 miles from Boston to Lexington, where they met a small contingent of American militia. It was there that a single shot started a small skirmish that the British quickly won. That shot later became known as the shot heard round the world. That is, the first shot of the Revolutionary War. All that happened on this spot. While it was interesting to know the history that took place here, it was equally impressive to finally see the changing tree colors in numbers that we had been waiting to see for the entire trip. We next drove to the Minuteman National Historical Park in Concord. After leaving the bus, we walked through a small wooded area filled with multicolored trees. At this point, our guide continued the story of the conflict between the Minutemen and the British. After the British won the earlier skirmish at Lexington, they continued on to Concord, following about the same path as the roads we had used to get there. At Concord, the British troops were met by a much larger American force. The two forces met at this bridge, called the North Bridge. The Americans soundly won that encounter, forcing the British troops back to Boston. After we left Concord, we traveled to Cambridge, just across the river from Boston. This was our last destination of the day, Harvard University. The sun had just come out as we got off the bus, which gave Robin great lighting for these pictures of the campus. As we were getting ready to leave, Robin got this picture of John Harvard, the founder of the university. Like another statue in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, people rubbed this statue's left foot for luck. We left Harvard, reboarded the bus, and were taken back to the ship. That afternoon, we went out on our balcony where the afternoon sun was bathing everything in a golden glow, including airliners landing at nearby Boston Logan International Airport. Using that sunlight, Robin and I shot these pictures of one another. That night, we looked through Robin's still pictures of our excursion that day and talked about everything we saw and did. We were happy that the next day, October 22nd, was another at-sea day. We needed the rest. For most of the day, we found a quiet niche like this. I read, and Robin started looking through all the pictures she had taken on the trip. The next day, October 23rd, we woke up early and just in time to see the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the gateway to New York for cruise ships. Within minutes, the New York skyline and then the Statue of Liberty came into view. We had traveled about 325 miles since leaving Boston and about 1,700 miles since leaving New York 9 days earlier. As we were docking back at Cape Liberty, I saw something that I had never seen on all my cruises before or since this one. The dock workers obviously fish while they are waiting for the cruise ships to come in. Where else but in New Jersey? So this then was our New England cruise to see the changing of the fall colors.